Real-time feedback into the behavior of your distributed systems and observing changes, exceptions, errors in real time allows you to not only experiment with confidence, but respond instantly to get things working again.
Hello everyone and welcome to this talk. Let's build a zero-cost invite-only website with Next.js and Airtable. So before we get started, let me tell you that the slides are already available online. You can get them by either scanning this QR code or visiting the link that you see down there in the slide. And the reason why I like to share the slides first is because I'm going to be showing you a bunch of code examples. You might be having questions after the talk, so it's just easier. It's just an easy way to get all the material if you enjoy this talk. But don't worry, you'll have the link to the slides even at the end of this presentation. So what's our mission for today? Today we want to build these invite-only websites. And to understand a little bit better what that means, let me give you literally a 15 seconds demo of this particular idea. So you can see in this particular slide that we have on the left side a kind of a spreadsheet which acts as our database, and there are different records. Every record has a unique ID, and we can use that particular unique ID as a query string parameter here on the website on the right hand side. And every time we change that query string parameter, you can see that the invite changes a little bit. We can see in this case hello Raffaello, before there was hello Michelangelo, and now there is hello Donatello. So basically you can have URLs that are customized for specific people. And if you provide the wrong invite code or you don't provide an invite code, you shouldn't be able to see anything. So this is just a simple way to have a database of people that we want to invite to an event and build a website that allows only these people to be able to access all the information related to that particular event. Okay, so what are the requirements for building something like this? Imagine that we are actually building this because we really want to host a particular personal event. We want to invite a few people. So we just, as software engineers, we want to have a custom cool website. But of course, we don't want to be spending months in building all of this. So the idea is that we want to iterate quickly. We need to have a solution that is very simple to host, very simple to maintain and update. We want a very lightweight backend. And also imagine that you are organizing this with a bunch of friends. So probably you want to be able to share with them the entire database because maybe they want to add people to the invitation list. They want to see whoever is saying that is participating to the event. So we need also a backend solution that is very easy to access for non-technical people. And now the best part, we probably want to build all of this in a cheap way and host it, if not cheap, for free. So let's see if we can find a solution that satisfies all of these requirements. But before we get into that, I didn't introduce myself, so let me do that. My name is Luciano, and I am a Microsoft MVP and a certified AWS solution architect professional. I work for a company called Fortiorem as a senior architect, and I'm based in Dublin, Ireland. One of the things that I'm mostly proud about in my career is that I am one of the co-authors of this book called Node.js Design Patterns. If it's a book that you have read, definitely let me know what you think. I always love to hear feedback. And if you haven't read that already, consider reading it. I really love to hear what you think about that. And feel free to connect with me. I am available in all this channel. So always we're looking forward to talk with people. So don't be shy. Feel free to reach out and let's connect. Okay, about Fortiorem, the company that I work for, it's a service company. We are mainly focused on cloud and AWS. We do a lot of serverless and cloud migrations. So if that's something that you are really interested into, definitely reach out to us. We are always hiring. We are always looking for new interesting projects. So again, don't be shy. Let's have a coffee and let's chat about business together. Okay, back to the talk. What's the agenda for today? So the first thing we want to do is, of course, choose a particular tech stack that should satisfy all the requirements we discussed before. Then we want to understand what is the data flow for this particular kind of application. So we're going to deep dive into that. We're going to be using Airtable, so we're going to be discussing a little bit how Airtable works and how can we use it as a database for a web application. And then we are going to be looking into Next.js and Vercel, which are other two components that we are going to be using in our architecture. So we want to see how to create APIs with Next.js. We want to also create a custom React hook for authentication. So we're going to be discussing all of that. And we're going to be seeing how can we allow the users to interact with our application, and how the user interaction can actually affect our database. For instance, users will be able to tell us if they are participating or not to our event, and when they select one of the options, that should be immediately reflected in our backend system. And finally, we are going to be discussing very quickly about some interesting security considerations. After all, we are trying to build a website that by default is private, and only people who have access to that particular website through an invite code should be able to see meaningful information. So there are some security considerations there, and we need to make sure that we are not leaking any private information to people that don't really have an invite code. Okay, let's look at the tech stack. We said that we are going to be using Next.js, Airtable, and Vercel. Also, we are going to be using GitHub as a hosting for all the source code. So the reason why I like this combination is because Next.js, if you know React, it's a very nice and simple framework to use. It gives you the opportunity to do not just the front-end code, but also to create APIs very easily. And when you use Vercel as a backend, not surprisingly, because Next.js is built by Vercel as well, it's very, very easy to take your code from GitHub and ship it to production, and then have everything working out of the box with very minimal configuration. For what concerns Airtable, it's a very nice tool that gives you like a spreadsheet kind of experience where you can create very lightweight databases, but also there are APIs, so you can use that database and that visual experience as a backend system for an actual web application when you combine that with APIs. And there is a very generous free plan. So for most of the, this is not true just for Airtable, but also for Vercel. So the idea here is that with this particular tech stack, we should be able to host an application that doesn't have a huge amount of traffic pretty much for free. So this is kind of one of the reasons why I like this stack, because for this kind of side projects where you may be creating an invite page for a private party, you are not going to be spending any money in hosting, and you can get everything up and running pretty quickly. Okay, so making an Next.js website private is maybe not something that you would want to do every day, because most of the time you're probably building public websites, I don't know, marketing pages, landing pages, SaaS applications. So what does it mean to actually make a Next.js website private? After all, it's going to be hosted in the public internet, because we just want to give people a public URL and they can access to that. So how do we actually make this thing that, even though it's everything public facing and publicly accessible to the internet, only people with a valid invite code can actually access the information that we want to disclose? So the idea is that every guest should see something different. This is actually another requirement that we want to use. If you remember from the demo, we had hello Michelangelo, hello Raffaello, hello Donatello. So every guest will get a customized page. And people that don't have an invite code should not be able to access any content. So they should be seeing only an error page that says something like, sorry, you don't have access here. So how do we make all of that happen when we use Next.js? So the idea is that we have a React single page application. This is what Next.js does for us, allows us to easily build a React single page application. Now, in this single page application, what we have is that the ability that if we pass a specific query string parameter, we can actually read it after the application bootstraps. So the application bootstraps, and in that state, it doesn't display anything. So the first thing that it needs to do is to check the current URL, load the secret, so the invitation code from the URL, and at that point, what it can do is to call an API in the backend, which is going to be hosted on Vercel, and it's going to tell, okay, I have this invite code. Is that invite code valid? And the API in return needs to look up into Airtable and check, do I have an invitation with this particular code? So it's going to try to read data from that particular Airtable spreadsheet. And if Airtable says yes, basically what happens is going to show the page to the user, say, for instance, hello, Michelangelo, you are invited. Or if Airtable says, sorry, I don't have this invitation code, that basically means that that invitation code is made up. It's somebody that is trying to guess an invitation code, or maybe it's an invitation code that we have removed. So in that case, we need to display something like access denied. So you can see that there is a kind of a client-side check for, given this particular secret, what should I display? And then that client-side application needs to do API calls to actually make sure to check, is this invitation code something valid or not? Can I display some information, or should I display access denied? So the first thing that we need to do to start to implement this solution is to organize the data in Airtable. Now, if you never used Airtable before, this is pretty much the idea. You can imagine as a dynamic CSV file with APIs. So we have records there. Every line contains a UUID, which is the unique invite code for every guest. And every record associates that particular UUID with guest information. For instance, their name. In this case, we have the favorite color. We have weapons, for instance, just to showcase one particular characteristic that you might have for guests. And if we want to understand better what Airtable calls all the different things, we have a base, which is pretty much a project. In this case, we are calling it Secret Pizza Party. Then we have the concept of a table. In our project, we only have one table, which is called invites, but you could be having multiple tables. And then in every table, you have multiple fields. In our case, we have invite, name, favorite color, weapon. And then we have records. For instance, here we have invited 4 people, so we have 4 different records. How do we start now our Next.js project? One of the things that I really like in Next.js is that there is a very nice system to bootstrap applications, and you can even specify whether you want to use TypeScript on NPM or Yarn or different other tools for dependency management. So how do you do that? You just say npx create next app, and you can even specify a version, and then you can pass extra parameter. And after you do that, basically you're going to be having a project structure already created for you. Now, note here that I'm using Next 12. Next 13 has been published very recently. I haven't tried yet, so I'm sticking with Next 12, but I don't expect to see big changes if you use Next 13. Okay, the next thing that we want to do once we have the project started, because we are using TypeScript, we can start to create some types that will be beneficial for us while we build all the front-end and back-end for our application. So in our case, we want to create an invite type, which contains more or less the same fields that we had in Airtable. Note that here I also have an optional field called coming, which is basically something we can use to track the preference of that particular guest to see if they are coming or not. Another thing that we need to do to be able to use Airtable in our backend, in our Next.js APIs, is we need to have API keys and base ID, which are things that we can find in the configuration of Airtable. So the idea here is that we install the Airtable SDK. This is an official package from Airtable. And then we export these environment variables so that we can use them to actually initialize the client and connect to our own account. Now, let's have a quick look at the APIs of Airtable. And this is actually one thing that I really like about Airtable, because if you look closely at these APIs, they are already giving you a documentation page that is already customized with all the fields that you have in your project. So this is not just showing a random set of examples, but these are actually real examples that will work with your particular project structure. So for instance, here, if we zoom a little bit, we can see that in this example, after we load Airtable, the SDK, we initialize a client with the API key and the base ID. You can see that this example already has invites, which is the name of our table. and it's showing us how to do a select in that particular table. So now this is not really very modern. JavaScript is not using ESM, it's using var rather than const and let. It's using callbacks. So we are going to be doing something a little bit more polished, but I still like the idea that this example is actually fine-tuned to your actual data and not some generic example. Okay, so let's try to do something ourselves. So what do? We want to use ESM, of course, because we want to write modern JavaScript. So we're going to be using import syntax. We're going to be importing Airtable and our invite type. And then what we do is we make sure that we have initialized our environment variables correctly. So if one of those environment variables is missing, we are not going to be able to call Airtable APIs. So we need to make sure that these environment variables are set. If not, we're going to be throwing an error. At this point, we can initialize our Airtable client, and we can define the base, the project that we want to reference to from this client. Now, all of this code is a utility file that we created under utils Airtable TS. So this way, what we can do is easily import this client and use it somewhere else. Or another idea is actually that we can export specific functions. So we build kind of our own data model layer in this particular file. And for instance, the first thing that we want to build is, if I have an invite code, can I retrieve an invite for that particular invite code? So we can create a function here which returns a promise. And this function, what it does is basically uses the SDK that we initialize in this file to do a select. Now this select, I'm not going to be spending too much time, but you can imagine that it's just checking in this particular table, if I use this invite code, is there a record that has a matching invite code? And we only want to get one record at a time. That's why we have max record equal 1. Now, don't worry too much about this escape function. It's something that we will be discussing at the end. Just keep it in the back of your mind. Then what we do, we take the first page and we want to make sure that if there is an error, we reject the current promise. Or if there is... if we get one page, but this page doesn't contain anything, that means that we didn't find an invite. So that's also something we consider an error. And finally, if we found an invite code, then what we do, we map all the data from Airtable into an object that represents our data model in our application. Okay, the next step is now that we have built all this data layer that allows us to interact with Airtable and fetch data from Airtable, specifically if we have an invite code, we can fetch all the data for that particular invite. What we need to do next, build an API inside Next.js API layer, and that API needs to expose that information to our front-end layer. So how do we build APIs with Next.js? This is another thing that I really like in Next.js, that it's very easy to build APIs. You just need to create a file inside Pages API. So there is a very specific folder structure in Next.js. It's file-based routing, it's called. And basically the idea is that if you create, for instance, in this example, a file called hello.ts, that means that your application will be exposing an API under /API/hello. So if we have this application running in localhost, we're going to be having something like localhost /API/hello. If we have it running on the web somewhere, there will be some domain name /API/hello. Then the interface is basically saying you need to import this next API request and next API response. And at this point, you can export an handler, and the handler takes a request and a response, and then you can use the response to return some data to the user. In this case, we are just returning a 200 successful response where the body is a JSON object containing message hello world. This is the simplest kind of API you could see, but of course this is not what we want to build. We actually want to build an API that takes as input an invite code, and it returns all the information related to that particular invite. So how do we go and do that? So we want to create a new endpoint, so it needs to live inside Pages API, and we are going to be calling it invite. So it's going to be called invite.ts. Now, the first thing that we do, we import our type, and we import our utility from the Airtable file we created before that allows us to fetch invites using an invite code directly from Airtable. Then we need to create an handler, and this handler will return an invite response. And there are a few things that we need to check. For instance, if this request is a get, is not a get, sorry, we are going to refuse because we only want to accept get, and we are going to return a 405 saying method not allowed. Then if there is no query string code, this is also another error because we don't have an invite code. So we are going to be returning a 400 saying missing invite code. Now, the next thing we want to do is that we need to normalize the code, because in Next.js, when you parse query strings, you might be having the same query string repeated multiple times. For instance, you might be having the same code repeated more than once. So what we want to do is to make sure that we take only the first instance of that code. And then what we do is we try to read the invite code using our Airtable helper. If we can fetch the invite code, that's what we return. Otherwise, there is an error, and we need to handle that particular error. Either it's an invite not found, or there is a server error, and we will be propagating the error accordingly to that. So how do we test this? If we have the application running locally, we can just do a curl with an invite code that we know exists, and we should be seeing something like this. So our API is using a JSON interface. We pass an invite code, we get back a JSON response with all the details associated to that particular invite that are coming from Airtable. Now, at this point, we have everything at the backend layer. So we have Airtable that contains all the data, is effectively our database. We have an API layer that allows us to read data from that database layer. Now we want to work on our single page application, so the front-end side. And the front-end side needs to manage all the lifecycle to bootstrap the application, read the invite code from the query string, call the API that we just implemented, and then based on the response of that API, it needs to display either a page, successful page with all the user information, or it needs to display an error. So we are effectively implementing an invite validation workflow in the single page application. So what's the attack plan? So when the SPI loads, we grab the code from the URL, we call the invite API with that particular code. If it's valid, then we render the content of that particular invite. If there is an error, most likely the invite code is not valid, so we need to render an error page. So how do we manage all this data fetching lifecycle in React and Next.js? So there are different options, and I actually tried to implement this in a bunch of different ways. The first idea might be we might have a top level component, for instance, app, and we can do all this loading in that top level component, for instance, by using a use effect hook. Another approach could be we could be creating a context provider. It's a quite common concept in React. You can create a context that allows you to expose some data to your entire application. So that context should take care of doing all this kind of interaction with our backend APIs, and eventually it's going to expose some data to the rest of the application. And the rest of the application will render accordingly to the data in the context. Another idea could be we could be implementing a specialized React hook, so a custom React hook that takes care of doing all of this. And this is actually the idea that I like the most, and I think the one that gave me the most concise code from a consumer perspective. So it's probably the easiest solution when you need to integrate it into your actual application. So the next question is, if you never built a custom React hook, how do we go and do that? And a custom React hook is just a JavaScript function that has the name starting with the word use. This is kind of a convention in React. Use effect, use state. So if you build your own hook, it's going to be called use something. And this particular function can also call underneath other hooks. So when we build this function, inside that function, we can use effect, use state, use callback, use memo, any other hook from the React core or even other custom hooks. It doesn't need to have any specific signature. So inside the function, all the common rules of hooks apply. Hooks are nice to use, but there are some weird rules that you need to get used to. And when you build a custom hook, the same rules apply. And the idea is that you can only call hooks at the top level of the function. Every React component is effectively a function, and you can use state, use effect only at the very top of that function. And when you call use state, use effect, or any other hook, they cannot be inside loops, condition, or other nested functions. And the idea is that every time the component renders, the hook needs to be always called and always be called with the same order as opposed to all the other hooks in that function. Now, these rules are defined by React, and this is just the way hooks are implemented in React. And you can find some more details and examples in the official documentation. Okay, so how do we create a custom hook? The first thing we want to do is, of course, to import our invite type, and then we will have our fetch invite function, which basically I'm not showing it here just for brevity, but the idea is that this is going to be doing a fetch request to the backend API, and it's going to return an invite response or an error. And now this is actually our custom hook, use invite. So what is the idea of this hook? That when we want to create a component that wants to check if a user has a valid invite code, we can just use this hook. We can just say use invite, pass an invite code, and then that hook will give us back the invite response. So we have a state that this hook needs to maintain some state inside, because basically it needs to say, is there an invite associated to this invite code? And if there is, it's going to be stored inside the state of this particular hook. Also, there might be errors. So we have another state, which is whether there are errors or not. And then the next thing that it needs to do is to, when this hook is actually being initialized in a component, we want to trigger a particular action. So there is an effect that needs to happen. And inside this effect, what we do is we try to read the code from the query string parameter. We try to see if there is a query string parameter called code, and we read that particular one. If there isn't, then that's an error. No code was provided. We can set the internal state of this hook as there is an error, and the error is that there is no code. Otherwise, we need to fetch the invite. So we are going to be calling our other function that makes an HTTP request. And if that HTTP request succeeds, we set the invite response. If it fails, we set an error with the message of that particular error. And at that point, the hook returns two values in an array, invite response and error. So how do we use it? It's actually very simple. Let's say that we have some example component. This is just a React component. And this component is just going to call use invite. And then inside use invite, we are going to be having either an invite response or an error. Now, keep in mind that all this stuff is asynchronous, because use invite will need to load some data, will need to do HTTP requests in the background. So we will have here different potential states. One state is when all the request was completed, but it was failing with an error. So we need to check, okay, if there was an error, we need to display the error. If there wasn't an error, but we don't have an invite response either, that means that we are still loading the data from the API. So we need to display some loading information, a spinner or something like that. And finally, the last state is when we actually completed everything successfully. So we have some data and we can render the page with the data. Okay, now that we know how to build a custom hook that can be used in a component to actually make sure that we render information only when the invite code is valid, and we render an error when the invite code is not valid, The next step is, what if we want to collect some user data? Now we are displaying a page for every single user, but we want to know if that particular user is going to attend our party or not. So we want to allow the user the opportunity to submit data to our backend. How do we do that? First of all, we need to do some changes. So we need to add new fields in Airtable. For instance, we can add a new field called coming, which allows us to store the information for every single invite in that table if the person invited is attending or not. Then we need to add new backend utilities in our Airtable helper to be able to update our table when we receive the information from the user. We need to add a new endpoint to our API, and then we need to update our React hook to also be able to not just read the data related to an invite, but also be able to change some of the data related to that particular invite. So adding a field to Airtable is easy. It's a visual tool. You just click and say add a new field, and you can also select a particular kind of field where you have only specific choices. For instance, here it can either be empty or it can be a yes or a no. So there are 3 potential states in this particular field. Now let's build first our RSVP utility. So a user can say whether they are attending or not. So what we want to do is to basically add a new piece of functionality in our Airtable helper that basically receives an invite code, receives an RSVP state, which can either be true, I am attending, or false, I'm not attending, and it returns a promise. So what it needs to do is it fetches the particular record for that invite code, and what it does, it calls this function called update with an ID, and it specifies the fields that needs to be updated. Now, if everything is fine, we resolve, or if there is an error, we reject. Nothing particularly complicated here. How do we create a new endpoint to be able to RSVP? So we need to create a new file inside pages API RSVP. So that means that we will be having an API endpoint called /API/RSVP. And here what we want to do is very similar to what we did before, but this time we want to accept only put requests. So if the request is not a put, we return a 405. If there is no code in the query string, again, we need to have an invite code to be able to update only that particular invite. So that's also going to be an error if we don't have an invite. Now at this point, what we need to do is we are going to be receiving in the request body the RSVP field. So imagine that we are going to be building later on some interaction in our UI. That UI will do a request. It's going to put in the put payload body a JSON object that represents for that particular user if they are coming or not. Imagine in a more advanced application, you might be having a bigger form, maybe with multiple fields. So in the body, you might be having multiple fields. In this case, we only have one particular field, which is going to tell us true or false. Again, we need to sanitize the query string. We need to read only one code if there are multiple ones. And then finally, what we do, we call our update RSVP using the request body.coming. And if everything is fine, we return a 200. If there is an error, either the invite was not found, so that's a particular error, or there was an internal server error. So now we need to update our hook to be able to not just load the invite information, but also to expose some piece of functionality that allows us, our single page application, to update the backend every time that the user does different kinds of interactions. So basically, before we were just returning an array with 2 values, the error and the invite response. Now it makes sense to create a proper object because we have more fields. So the fields that we want to use, in addition to the existing ones, is updating, which basically tells us if the current state of the hook is sending a request to the backend to update the data. And then we have another function that can be used by our frontend to actually trigger the update. So when the user clicks in the coming UI saying I'm coming, yes or no, the frontend is going to be able to call this particular function to actually trigger an action to the backend. So the idea of this hook is that basically we don't want to expose to whoever is utilizing the hook all the business logic that is required to update, to interact with the backend, but we just want to expose an interface, and that interface is part of the hook return data. Okay, so the next thing that we do is fill the details here, and basically the use invite now it's slightly updated. And the changes that we are making is that now we also have a new additional state, which is updating, set updating. So this is the new piece of information that we can use to show, for instance, a spinner when the user clicks on a preference for RSVP. We need to show a spinner while that request is in progress. And then when updating is not, it's false, then at that point we can hide the spinner. Use effect is everything the same. This is used to load the invite from the backend, and this doesn't change. Then we have a new function called update RSVP, and what this does is basically checking if there is an invite response, we want to set the updating field, the updating state to true, because we are about to make a request to the backend, and that request is going to update our table. So while that request is in progress, we need to show the spinner. At this point, we actually do the request, and when we receive a response, we are gonna be updating our invite response in the state of the hook. And finally, we set updating to false. So again, the idea is that this hook needs to somehow take care of managing all the life cycle of this data. This invitation object can change, and it will take care of keeping track of the current value for that invitation object, keeping track of if there are any error, keeping track if we are in the process of updating the backend, and all this information is available through the hook, so we can use this information to render different things in our UI. So finally, we can use this hook, and this is just a simplified version of our actual application. So what we do is we call useInvite, and this time we receive back an object, and from this object we can destructure the 4 properties that we want to use: invite response, error, updating, and update RSVP. Now, if there was an error, we need to display an error. If there is no invite response, it means that we are still doing the initial loading from the backend of that particular invite, so we display a loading information. Then we create an handler, and this handler says, when the user clicks on a preference, whether they are coming or not to the party, we want to invoke this handler, and this handler is gonna read the current preference and use it to update the backend. And finally, we have our form, and in this form, we attach the handler, and we have effectively 2 checkboxes, and the user can say, I'm coming true, I'm coming false. And every time they change that preference, it's going to make a request to the backend, and it's going to update the table in Airtable. So that's everything we need to do. Let's see a 15 seconds demo of that. So here I have my Airtable on the left side and the application running on the right side. So what we want to do, initially we don't have any code. So what we want to do is to load the first user, the first invitation. So here we have Leonardo, and Leonardo can say, okay, I'm coming. Okay, let's try the second one. Now we have another invitation, and this time we say no. And this is updating in real time, as you can see. The third one, we can say no again, and it's updating in real time. And the fourth one is going to be saying yes. And you can see that if I change the preference, also this is reflected more or less in real time. So the UI is making sure to call the hook. The hook is calling our Next.js backend API. The Next.js backend API is connecting to Airtable, and this is how we keep things in sync between our frontend and our database. How do we deploy all of this? This is actually the easiest part, because if we use GitHub and Vercel, the only thing that you need to do is go create an account on Vercel using your own GitHub credentials. So you do a OAuth login using GitHub. And at that point, there is just a few steps that you need to do to basically select the repository where your source code lives. And because that's going to be a Next.js application, Vercel already recognizes that and makes it available on Vercel. And you get a custom URL, but which contains something like vercel.app at the end. But if you want to use your own custom domains, you can also connect a custom domain. Okay, now that we know how to deploy the application, we are pretty much done, except that I mentioned that one of the last topics I wanted to cover is some security considerations. Again, we are building a website that effectively contains some private information. We don't want to disclose all of that information to everyone in the world. We just want to make sure that people that have an invite code can see that information. Other people shouldn't be seeing anything private. So what kind of problems can we have? How can people actually try to exploit our website? Even if they don't have an invite, they can try to extrapolate some useful information, and maybe they show up at the party even if they are not invited. So the first thing that we need to be careful is that because we are building a single page application, most of the information that we have in our website is effectively going to be compiled inside the client-side JavaScript that then eventually is made available by the browser. So if we have a clever user that knows how to use the debugging tools and read the original source code in JavaScript, they could be actually finding some sensitive information. For instance, here you can see that we are highlighting where the event is taking place, the day when it's taking place, and this is already a quite sensitive piece of information. So even if they don't have an invite code, because you can see here that the UI is saying invalid code, all that information is still embedded in the JavaScript bundle, so they can actually look into that and extrapolate some sensitive information. So this is probably something that we want to avoid, but how can we avoid that? And there might be different ways to fix this, but the idea is that if you hard code anything inside your React templates, inside your JSX, that piece of code will end up in the compiled JavaScript bundle, and that JavaScript bundle is something that is surfaced to the user regardless if they have an invitation code or not. So the first thing to do is don't hard code any sensitive information in your JSX. You should be using some placeholder in your template, and then you should populate that placeholder only when you verify that the user has an invitation code that is valid. So one idea to do that is basically to update our API to return with the invitation data also a set of messages that then can be interpolated in the UI. For instance, I don't know, the time and the place where the party takes place can be part of the response that we receive only when we have a valid invite code. So only the API is going to be aware of this information. The frontend only needs to interpolate that information. If we do that, the JavaScript bundle that we are going to generate is not going to display this information. It's only going to display some placeholder variables that cannot be known by a user that doesn't have an invite code. If you want to see this working, actually, I'm going to be giving you a repository with the complete example, and I'm implementing this solution there. So you can actually see a working complete implementation of this idea. Now, a slightly more complex problem, and this is something that I was actually figuring out, and I reported it to Airtable because this is something that can be very dangerous. If you ever used SQL, you probably know of the term SQL injection, which is basically when you have user data that gets interpolated into a query, a malicious user can actually give you very specific pieces of information that try to alter the shape of that query to do something that the user was not really intended to do. For instance, here, even if we are using Airtable, because Airtable has a query language, and we are using user data, which is the invite code, which is coming from a query string parameter, so something that the user could change if they wanted to. We are basically interpolating that information in our query, so we need to be careful that the user is not really trying to inject anything malicious to try to break our query. If a user doesn't know valid invite code, what they could be doing is to try to craft an invite code that manipulates our query to basically say invite equal true. So any invite should match that particular type of query. And if they are able to generate that kind of query, they're basically getting access to our application without knowing an actual valid invite code. So in a way, we are trying to do, or at least we are trying to prevent any injections in the formula. This is the name that query are called in Airtable, that the user could be doing to manipulate the formula to their advantage. So imagine here that we have an escape function. I mentioned it before, but I didn't show you the code. Imagine that we didn't have the escape function. This is what our code could be. It's like literally saying the invite in the table needs to be the same as the invite that we are receiving from the user. Again, keep in mind that this invite code is something that the user is giving us. So in this particular string interpolation, the user can do something to actually change the structure of this particular query. Let's see an example. So this is actually a valid example. When the user is giving us this code, what happens is that we build the following formula, which is totally valid and there is no problem with it. Now, if there is a malicious user that gives us this particular query, in the query string, they put this particular code, which if you decode it, it pretty much looks like this. So code is equal to an open string where we say major equal to 0 and something else. And basically, if we interpolate this particular string, what we get as the final formula is pretty much this. We are saying the invite is empty, needs to be major or equal than 0 and empty. And this is, don't worry too much about the meaning of this, but the problem with this is that this formula is always going to be true for every single record. So Airtable formula is just going to match whatever record comes first in our table. And what happens if we actually try to put that into our URL is that a user is going to have access straight away and is going to get any arbitrary user. In this case, Donatello, because it's probably the first one that matches in our table. But a user without a valid user code was able to actually get access without a valid user code by crafting this particular injection. So how can we prevent this particular flow? And we need to use an escape function. And unfortunately, Airtable doesn't give you an escape function by default. It's something that I highlighted to them, and hopefully they will be working on it in the future and provide, as part of the SDK, an official sanitization or escape function. So this is just my own implementation, but be careful that this implementation might not be 100% bulletproof. So make sure to review it. And also, if you have a similar use case, make sure to reach out to Airtable, because they should be eventually providing their own their own official tested escape functionality to avoid injections in Airtable. So we are done pretty much with this talk. Let's try to recap and wrap things up. What are some of the limitations that you might incur with this solution? Airtable, when you use the free plan, has a very strong rate limiting. You can only do 5 requests per second. And keep in mind that when we update a record, we actually do 2 requests, because we need to make sure that the invitation code is correct. And then we update the invite code. So that could be one of the problems. What are some of the alternatives? You could be using Google Spreadsheets. There is also an API and different packages on NPM. You could be using DynamoDB with Amplify. You could be using Firebase, any headless CMS, Supabase, Strapi. There are many, many alternatives that you could be using as something that could replace Airtable in case you don't like Airtable. And most of these things are either free or there are very generous entry-level plans. So for your small website, you're not going to incur in massive costs. So what are the takeaways from this talk? That we just saw a case study for a quick and easy and cheap solution that you can use if you need to build an invite-only website. We learned about Next.js. We learned specifically about the API endpoints, how you can build custom React hooks, how can you integrate with backends such as Airtable using their own SDKs, and we also learn a bunch of security related things. Now, this solution is just one of the possible solutions, and for a very specific use case. Don't just copy paste it for any other similar use case. Always make sure to evaluate your context and assess whether your context fits this particular implementation. Probably if you just copy this code, it's not going to fit your use case. You will need to change something. So the takeaway here is just take some of the lessons and then try to apply them to your code base. Don't just copy paste code blindly. And I have written all this information in an article. Probably there are even more details there and the code that is easy to copy paste. Also, as I said, there is an entire code base that works with the example I showed you before on GitHub. So you can check these two links if you want to get all the code or if you want to read the same content that I explained here in the form of an article. And that's everything I have. Thank you very much. I hope you found this interesting. And if you have any question, feel free to reach out to me and I'm more than happy to try to answer your questions. Bye.